like I stated in my previous video, and not just passively taking in this information, and you want to take some notes on it. Those are the 4 core abilities that we have. Being able to see a static image, we're able to see a moving image, we can see an actual experience or a scenario or whatever, and we can imagine the details from a spatial recognition perspective. And when you combine all of these core abilities, this will help you determine that you really know what's happening, and welcome back, all my ninjas. Appreciate y'all tapping back in with your boy. In this video today, I'll get straight to it. It's going to be about how our mind works. By the end of this video, you will be able to understand a new aspect of your mind. Also, with this new understanding, you'll be able to take this information and develop a strategy where you can apply these techniques of mental training and to where you can accelerate your learning process at an exponential level. That's what I'm trying to implement into my study processes and trying to be a master learner. And I'm confident that if you learn this new skill and you develop it over the course of time, that you'll be able to as well enhance your memory retention on anything that you're studying, or as long as you need that information relevant to you. First and foremost, before we even jump into anything, I definitely want to give credit where credit is due. Any of this information, all this other stuff that I'm about to share, I'm definitely not the expert of psychology and all this cognitive science and everything. It's information I've gathered from just YouTube University, right? Dr. Andrew Huberman. I've also gathered this information from Dr. Stephanie Burns. She is, if you don't know, she has a PhD in adult learning. She has a webinar on Cisco's site. I've used it's probably like 10 years old now, but I've been using it. I constantly refer to it as great information, and it's mainly what I'm sharing in this playlist. That's the main core or main resource that I got all of this information from. So shout out to them, and I'll leave a link in the description below as a resource. Let's refresh. If you didn't, I highly recommend you go ahead and check out my previous video on how to make study memorable, because it's just going to make this video even more easier to understand. In that previous video, I just touched on imagination and to use it to make what you're learning more memorable. I just touched on it, but this video, I really wanted to drive home that concept, right? Because being able to use your imagination is the fundamental process, or one of the fundamental concepts that you're going to have to grasp to begin to learn how to do this mental training and train your mind. And this is because we have 4 core abilities that allow us to know that we know something. Just having that awareness that you have these abilities will help you to begin to develop a strategy to strengthen them, and then ultimately it's going to accelerate that learning process. Our minds just work by being able to have mental images in our heads. That's why we talk about imagination. That's where it starts off, is of how we learn stuff. And this fundamental concept of learning is just this basic understanding that we're able to create images in our head. Just from having mental images, we know that helps us to compare the images, and then that lets us know that we could talk about the images and that we know for certainty what we're talking about, right? When we're able to have these static images or even these moving images. But beyond that, we have the ability to actually see an experience. And then on top of that, we have the ability to see that experience in detail. And what I mean by that is in the perspective like spatial recognition. Simply put, like you can imagine something that's near and that's far from you. Just having these 4 core abilities are crucial to understanding. So if you're actively listening, like I stated in my previous video, and not just passively taking in this information, and you want to take some notes on it, those are the 4 core abilities that we have. Being able to see a static image, we're able to see a moving image, we can see an actual experience or a scenario or whatever, and we can imagine the details from a spatial recognition perspective. And when you combine all of these core abilities, this will help you determine that you really know what you know and what you don't know. So to really understand how powerful and fundamental this concept is, and to illustrate it more clearly, I'm going to provide some examples, right, of applying this specifically for like studying for a Cisco exam, more specifically like CCNA. For example, for CCNA, we all know that there's several processes that we have to learn and we have to remember, from the most basic of how to create a VLAN to more complex stuff that I'm doing right now in this NRC exam. Is you need to know processes for route maps, for BGP path selection, all kinds of stuff, right? We're going to need a way to recall that information as quickly as possible, because on this test, they're giving you what, on average, maybe a minute and a half or something. I think it's some crazy low number like that, right? To do all of these questions. You got like 50 some questions on these Cisco exams, and you got like 2 minutes each. And you got to parse through output. Sometimes you're going to be in the lab environment, going to have to configure stuff without having any kind of context sensitive help. All this kind of stuff is going to come into play. And you need an edge when you go in there, right? Besides having your knowledge, you're going to need an edge going in there when you get stuck on these problems. Let's go ahead and break that down as far as, let's use an example for creating a VLAN, that process, to help explain more what I mean. Instead of using the OCG or going through YouTube, use your own imagination and build that process from something that you will remember. So like I said, don't use the OCG book only, and don't just use anybody's content on YouTube on how to create a VLAN. Use your own imagination. That's why imagination is so more important than knowledge. So right now, here's another example. Here it is. Here's an example of just the knowledge of how to create a VLAN, right? To create a VLAN, use the VLAN ID command, where VLAN ID is the desired VLAN number, assigning a name to each VLAN using the name VLAN name command, where VLAN name is the desired name for the VLAN, assigning switch ports to VLANs using the interface ID command, where interface ID represents the specific switch port. In other words, FA01. Like, I'm already with that dry technical stuff, like I'm already turned off, not trying to learn. My brain is shut down. I don't even know where to start. What's a good starting position? You know what I'm saying? Where does it go to? How do I troubleshoot that? And all these other kind of things. So now that's just the knowledge. This is why imagination is more important to it. Because check me out now. Since I like basketball, I'm using my imagination, right? And I'm going to develop the process of creating a VLAN with my own imagination. So as an example, I'll begin. All right, I got all of that knowledge, right, of how to create it. So in my mind's eye, I can say, hey, I've been called to play for the Cisco networking team basketball camp, and they're flying everybody out to LA, and we get to play in this stadium that they created for us. It's a big event and all of this other stuff. They got the blimps out there with the name of the stadium, and we're flying over top of the stadium. You can see it in big bold letters. The name of the stadium is Config T. So in my imagination, the first part of my process is Config T, because that's the first thing in my story to myself of this in my imagination that's so relatable to me, right? I could see that kind of stuff in my mind's eye. So what's next after Config T? Okay, well, I walk into the stadium and I look over and I see a jersey booth. So I walk over to the jersey booth to give me a souvenir, and it's a create your own jersey booth. And guess what? On the instructions that they're given to me is that you need to create your own jersey, and you need to put a number on the back and the team name on the front and everything like that, right? So what do I do with that information? Now I'm picturing very vividly a colorful jersey with the Lakers colors, and I could see on the back of the jersey it says VLAN for the name, and then the number 13 for the VLAN ID, right? So that's the second part, right? And then on the front part it says name across the front of the jersey, and then the name of my team, which is the name of the VLAN. Let's just say IT department. Let's just put that across the front of the jersey, right? So that's the team name, IT department. Then we got VLAN and the number 13 on the back. Good. So we got Config T, we got VLAN, VLAN ID, and we got the VLAN name all on there. Now, the next thing I do is I head down to courtside, where I hand them over my interface badge to get into this special area for configuring these interfaces, right? So to speak, in our imagination. So I walk in there And now what am I confronted with? I got a roster sheet. And on this roster sheet, I have different columns. The columns are for the player's name, the player's jersey number, the player's status, and then we have one for player assignment. We'll start filling out that roster sheet in my mind's eye. I could recall that information. That's pretty easy if you ever seen a roster sheet, if you've played any kind of basketball, organized basketball or whatever. If not, come up with your own thing, but this is just me, right? So roster sheet, column 1, what's the player? Kobe Bryant, right? That's easy for me to remember. I'm always going to remember Kobe, whatever basketball player you want to name. The next column over, what do you want to put on his jersey? I'm going to put the command, interface FA01. That's what I want to put for his number on the back of his jersey for the jersey number column. What's the next number? What's his status? You know, like these players can be benched, they could be active or whatever. In this column, I'm going to put switch port mode is the name of the column. And then I'm just going to put access to fill out his switch port mode access for that command, right? And then in the last column, it's to player assignment. So switch port and then access VLAN and then my VLAN number, which is 13. So I'm just going to remember that command, switch port access VLAN, VLAN 13. That's how I fill out what the player assignment is. So now I have a fully configured VLAN, but as I look up at the scoreboard, what do I see? A big banner that says show VLAN brief. And then on the screen pops up my roster sheet, which is just the output of all of that information. So for my VLAN, I got my VLAN name up there. What's my team name? I can recall that. It's called IT department, right? And then the VLAN number, VLAN 13. And then the roster sheet pops up. I got the player's name, Kobe. Check. I got interface for his jersey number, interface FA01. Check. That's done. I've got his switch port mode access. Check. That's done. And I got switch port VLAN. I meant switch port access VLAN and then the VLAN ID. And that's done. And now I've created a whole VLAN. So in my opinion, that is a lot better to tell myself that kind of story, to try to recall that process rather than trying to recall it from creating VLANs using the VLAN ID command, where VLAN ID is the desired VLAN number. Is too dry. You feel me? And you don't have to use basketball. Use something that you could relate to, whatever it is. There's something that you can use with your imagination. And that's why imagination is so much more powerful than knowledge, the fundamental concept of the learning process. Hopefully by now you're be able to see that being able to see or walk through a process and talking about it out loud helps reinforce or showcase your strengths and weaknesses in the process. For example, if I try to repeat that process to you again and I left out that switch port mode access part, I'll be like, okay, then I need to do something else. I need to rework that imagination because it's not really sticking. But I'm getting everything else. I know how to configure the interface, configure the VLAN and the VLAN name. I know that all of those things off the top of my head. And I'll just give you another quick example for OSPF, for example. I've done this with OSPF. I'm currently applying it. So like OSPF, you can't tell me nothing about these network types, right? You've got all these different network types that you got to know. Broadcast. You got to know point-to-point, point-to-multipoint. And then you got to know whether it's a non-broadcast multi-access point-to-multipoint or just a point-to-multipoint. Right? And then you got to know if it's a non-broadcast multi-access network type. And with all those different network types, you have different characteristics that you have to know, right? So for a broadcast, you have to know whether those neighbors are dynamically discovered or if you have to configure that neighborship, right? Because some network types like non-broadcast multi-access and point-to-multipoint non-broadcast multi-access, you're going to have to configure that neighborship, right? But you don't have to do that on the other three, which are broadcast, point-to-multipoint, and point-to-point network types. You don't have to configure those neighborships, right? Also on broadcast, the default interface for broadcast network types is LAN. You're going to have to know that. You're going to have to know the default timers, 10 and 40 versus 30 and 120 for non-broadcast multi-access. How am I able to pull all of that? Because you want to hear the little story that I got in my head. So for OSPF, I just think of OSPF. I meant for a broadcast network type, I just think of this big white house, right? And above that is a big blue name above it in big bubble letters that says broadcast. And on the front lawn of the White House, they got LAN interfaces. I just put a picture of LAN in my head, a big number of land, you know, like the little sticks that they put in there for like when they're doing lawn, like the lawn service people advertising that they did the pesticides. This one on the front house, the White House or whatever lawn says land. So just imagining these silly things. It may sound silly, but you see your boy able to spit that information off the top of my head. It goes for OSPF, it goes for route maps, it goes for ACLs, for prefix lists, for BGP, for route reflectors. You know, for all of this information, I'm applying all of it to accelerate this learning process. Hopefully all of that's making sense right now. And if it doesn't, let me just hurry up and try to get through this last part from Dr. Andrew Huberman. And this is what really made me start waking up and realizing the power of this mental training. Have you ever heard someone saying like that the body doesn't know whether or not what its experience is imagined or if it's the real experience? Well, according to Dr. Andrew Huberman and all these other, so I don't want to say according to him actually, but this is very true, but this is only at the neural level. So if you've never heard of that, there's studies or something, you can look it up, where people have been tested, like they scanned their brain scans and everything and had them imagine running a mile, and then they had them actually running a mile. So they actually run a mile physically. You can see that the body's sweating and it's going through that whole process of running, and it's tired physically and everything, the body is, right? But when it imagined it, the nervous system went through all of the same things that it did physically, but none of the physical stuff like the sweating and stuff never happened. But the body still experienced that same experience of running when they were imagining it. So that should help illustrate that point even more. And if it doesn't, let me break this down even further, because although that is true at the neural level, it's not true when we're speaking of the capability of learning at the cognitive level in this physical realm that we actually exist in, and not this imagination realm, right? Here are some experiments. One of the experiments you can do right now is just close your eyes and picture the image of an elephant and a mouse. So when you're picturing these images, you already know y'all have a relative reference of the size, and we already know that our brain is really good at comparing things to make sure that we know for certainty what we're imagining or what we're seeing is actually what that real image would look like in our real world experience, right? So if I were to ask you which animal is bigger or smaller, I mean, within no time at all, you'd be able to process that information and give me an answer really quick, right? You'd be able to say whichever animal I asked is bigger or smaller, you'd be able to process. Now here is where this mental imagery and all of this mental imagery and how it applies to learning starts coming into place. So now if I ask you to imagine that, right, the same picture, but this time imagine the details on the face of the mouse. Like whether it has whiskers or if it doesn't have whiskers. If it does have whiskers, how many whiskers does it have? And now the time that it takes you to process that information versus the time I ask you to tell me whether the trunk of the elephant's nose or the elephant's trunk is up or down. The time for you to tell me that information versus the time to tell you the details of that face of the mouse is going to be two totally different times, right? I'm not even seeing that picture of that trunk of the elephant, but I know for certain that you would be able to tell me very quickly. But I also know for certain you couldn't tell me quickly in your imagination the details of that mouse's face. Why do I know that it's going to take you longer to process that? It's because of that whole thing about what they said, what's experienced in imagination is experienced in real life as well, right? So it's the same thing. If you're sitting and you have both of those animals in front of you, and I ask you both the same questions, right? Which animal's bigger? Your brain's going to process that quickly in reality. It's going to be able to say, hey, I compare these things. This one's bigger, this one's smaller, right? And then the same thing's going to happen as well if I say, ask about some details about the specific face on the mouse. You're going to have to zoom in with your eye, with your actual eyes, not your mind's eye, because you zoomed in with your mind's eye to get it when we were doing the imagination stuff. Now, in physical reality, you're going to have to zoom in with your mind's eye. With your physical eye and get the details to give me the information. Versus, you don't have to zoom in to see whether the trunk on the elephant, this big ass elephant, you don't have to see if the trunk is up or down. You can see that very quickly and give me that information very quickly. So that's what's so profound about that study, is that it takes the same amount of time to process in your imagination, whatever you're imagining, the same as in the real world, right? So Hopefully that makes sense, and if it doesn't, let me give you one more experiment and then we'll wrap it up. Now this experiment really drove it home to me, right? This one was done by, I believe, Steve Koslick, and these are cognitive scientists. The other one was Dr. Roger Shepard, the one that did the elephant and the mouse, I believe. This one is, they gave a group of participants, they gave them all a map or whatever, right, of an island, and this island had landmarks, different landmarks. You have a restaurant on the north shore of it, and then you're gonna have like some boat docks on the south shore. You got some beaches somewhere, you got some areas where wildlife is to stay away, some danger areas on the map, right? They gave them all these participants this map, and they said to imagine going from landmark to landmark. So for example, they said imagine going from the restaurant on the north shore, travel down to the south shore boat docks, and then over to the beaches over there, right? They told them to do that. What was so incredible about what they found in their study is that the same amount of time that it took them to imagine themselves traveling in their imagination, and we're saying that they were walking, right, in this experiment, or in their imagination they told them to walk, the same amount of time that it took them for them to walk from that landmark to landmark was the same amount of time that it actually took them to do it in real life. And what's the relevance of that? Is that your brain and your mind does not distinguish between the experience that's being imagined and the actual experience that's taking place. And that's what's so incredible about that. And those experiments and everything that I talked about really illustrate and drive that point home. But it also lets us know that just because we imagine something, that's not going to manifest that reality, or that's not going to improve that kind of learning performance that we're trying to do. What I am saying is that if I use that imagination, like creating a VLAN, use that imagination, and then I apply it and I actually create the VLAN in the real world, right? So the amount of time that it takes me to think of config T, right? Create the VLAN, blah, 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 and do the whole little scenario, or even troubleshoot OSPF and all of these things, that's going to be the same amount of time that it's going to take me to do that in the real world, because that's where I'm pulling the information from. I'm pulling it from my imagination. So until I can get that imagination and that process more vivid, step by step by step, like I go to config T terminal and I go to config T stadium, and then I walk in and I get the jersey and it has the VLAN, boom, boom, boom. The faster I get that process down, the faster I'm going to be able to do it. And the only way that I'm going to get that process down fast is by marrying the two, the physical and the imagination. So I would have to go through that process, and then as I'm going through the process, I need to go ahead and physically create the VLAN or whatever you're trying to learn, and you got to physically apply it. So I hope all of that made sense. That's pretty much everything that I got for you guys today on that one. Again, if you're feeling this content, please like, drop that comment, definitely subscribe to the channel, share this video for anybody that's trying to level up their IT knowledge and their experience. Appreciate y'all for tapping in once again, and y'all holla at your boy. I'm gonna catch y'all on the next video. Holla at me. Peace.